I've spent most of my professional life working with people who work and live and practice in challenging environments. And I want to talk to you a little bit about imagination and inspiration and what it does to us. This is a picture of Mount Everest, and it's a picture of Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing, who were the first two to the top. And that was lodged in my mind when I was 7 years old by a very inspirational form mistress who had her class build a three-dimensional model of Mount Everest as the expedition was going along. And we plotted the course of the climbers to the top of the mountain, and we made models of their breathing kit. And that planted in my mind at the age of 7 an enduring interest in this very strange environment where people struggled to survive, where something funny had happened to the air, where it was extremely cold, all the problems of survival. And it captured me. It had a secondary effect, because that secondary effect was that this capture was complete. And a few years later, when I was around about 10 or 11, I made a very firm decision that I wanted to be a doctor. And part of the inspiration of that was this. And it meant that I actually worked far harder at my formal studies because I could see a purpose for where my formal studies were taking me. That was a 7-year-old little boy with his grandfather. But when we talk about education, what actually do we mean? Because we have this division of formal and non-formal, and a lot of what we talk about when we talk about education is actually the acquisition of knowledge and of qualifications. But there are a whole series of other things that are crucially important. It's what the previous speaker was talking about when he talked about the soft skills, the development of character, the encouragement of creativity, communication, ethics, hugely important, and knowledge of society. But what happens to us when we learn? What is this process? Because learning is a process that goes on in the brain. It's a process where nerve cells make connections. And with repetition of learning, those connections become permanent. And we have a phrase in neuroscience, which is that nerve cells that fire together wire together, and that wiring becomes hard. And that is important, because in this process of hard wiring, the skills that we learn, we actually set up in the brain as subroutines. They exist below consciousness. And crucially, the brain is plastic. The brain is immensely flexible in its learning. It's most adaptable, most flexible when it is young, but some of that adaptability is retained throughout life. We continue to have the ability to learn. I am finding learning Czech is an awful lot more difficult now than it would have been if I'd done it as a youngster, but I still retain some capacity to be able to do it, even if, as my wife tells me, the only words I actually know are stolny tennis, because that's how we actually manage to meet over a stolny tennis table. So let's have a look at what actually happens in the brain. This is a brain scan. Technically, it's a functional MRI. And on the left, you can see the brain completely lit up. You can see the frontal area of the brain, that's the bit at the top, very active. You can see the rear part of the brain, very active, and scattered illumination across it. And that is a brain that is actively engaged in learning a new task. If you look at the image on the right, that is the same person, the same brain, executing the same task, but the difference is now that task has been learned. And so you can see that one of the things the brain has done is it has managed to find an algorithm, if you like, but it has found a process whereby it can be really economical in terms of energy and in terms of computing power in doing that task. And the easy way to think about this is to think about what happened when you learned to ride a bike. Because if you remember, when you first got onto a bicycle, it consumed all of your consciousness. This sort of wobbling along, trying to keep your balance, trying to steer, all of that occupied the whole of your brain. And then one day, it all clicked, it all came together. And you found you were able to ride down the street, chatting to your friends, and you didn't think about the process of riding your bike at all. And what had happened was, all the necessary programs had come together in a very economical way, and the brain had stored them below the level of consciousness. You just got on with it. So we go through this process at school, we learn. We learn our tables, we learn how to read, we learn how to write. And we come from this process of rituals, of examinations, and hopefully getting satisfactory qualifications. And we come into the next phase of our life, and the next phase of our life is either higher education or it's going into the world of work. But do we actually have the nerve connections that we need? What happens when we leave school? The process of learning continues, but very commonly, the university or the employer says that education has actually not equipped the student with the right skills. And in most cases, those skills are those of being able to communicate, to work in teams, to get on with each other, and to self-start. And this really comes to the previous speaker's point about teaching people soft skills. I've worked in the aviation industry for almost half my life, and it's a very interesting industry. One of the exercises that we went through in the industry quite some time ago now was to ask pilots on a flight deck what qualities did they look for in the pilot that they were flying with. We're talking about commercial pilots who are sitting, flying you from country to country every day of the week. And the expectation, when the question was first asked, was that people would say, we want them to be good pilots. Interestingly, we didn't get that as an answer, because the pilots assumed that the training had been okay, that the pilot had the necessary skills. And they said that the qualities that they wanted in people were these. They wanted in their co-pilot, or they wanted in their captain, that the person should be stable, should be relaxed, should be confident, should be practical. They should be natural, they should be easy to get on with, conscientious, people who take time and thought to get things right. Time and again, when you go to an aviation accident where by some feat of piloting skill, you find that the captain has avoided the aeroplane crashing, one of the things that you find is that the captain has thought very carefully about how this aeroplane might fail and has practiced getting out of failure modes time and time again in simulators. I could find you lots of examples of that, but I don't have time now. It's a great fun area. And also, that the person you fly with should be realistic, that they should be able to understand what is in very, very short order, understand what is practical, what is doable, not what is nice to do and can't be achieved. I went from the aviation industry to the marine industry, and I spent 12 wonderful years of my life working with the Marine Rescue Service in the British Isles. It works for the whole of the British Isles, for the United Kingdom and for Ireland. It's called the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. And this is an institution substantially of volunteers who take boats to sea, take lifeboats to sea, where most of us, or the sensible ones amongst us, are pulling our duvets up beneath our nose and making sure that the windows are properly fastened against the storm that's rattling outside. These people go to sea when we would rather be at home. And we went through this same exercise with the lifeboatmen of asking what did they want in the people, what characteristics did they want in the people they went to sea with? Because these are people who are going to sea potentially in very, very dangerous conditions indeed. And they wanted their crewmen to be competent, to be knowledgeable, to be calm under pressure. They wanted them to be fair in their dealings with people. They wanted them to have integrity. They wanted vision, they wanted honesty, they wanted concern about people as individuals. And they wanted people who would collaborate with each other. And interestingly, these, of course, are the sort of qualifications that you tend to look for in an employer, or qualities that you look for as an employer in people who you're going to appoint as managers. Because these are people who have these qualities who act as role models. So where do we find the ability to train people in these sorts of things? How do we train for these soft skills? Well, one way of training for these soft skills is to use some of the programs that are out there. And one such example, and my friend Thomas Vokach, I think, has already spoken a little this morning, and I believe he's speaking later on today. But one of them is through a program that can run through schools called the Duke of Edinburgh Award. And this was set up originally in the United Kingdom, but is now international. And it's a non-formal educational scheme for young people that gets them to participate in physical activities. It gets them to learn new skills. It gets them volunteering. It gets them into expeditions, going out into the wild with some of their colleagues and learning how to survive. And for the top award, it takes them out into novel environments and says, hey, you've got to stay and live with these people for a period of time, and you have to survive. Now, why does all of this matter? If we go back, if you just go back to thinking about that picture of the brain learning and this idea that neurons that fire together wire together, learning is about getting neurons to do things. And if you spend all your time on digital devices, your brain develops in a particular way. You become very skilled at doing digital devices, but you don't acquire the other skills. We had a real problem with young lifeboatmen coming into lifeboats. They were absolutely wizard on the electronics and the navigation systems. They understood it. What they were really bad at, because they hadn't, increasingly now, they hadn't grown up in boats, was they didn't have that inbuilt wiring that you would develop as a child that says, this is how a boat moves. I recognize how a boat moves. I'm not thinking about it. Along with that, they didn't have the feeling for danger when you are near rocks or when you're by the side of a ship and you're going up and down like this. Very, very dangerous period on a boat, and you really have to have your wits about you. If you spent your time in the classroom playing with your digital device, you don't have that feel. The brain responds to what we learn by changing. Very good example is the London taxi cab driver, the black taxi. He has to learn the streets of London and the routes around London by heart. He doesn't have a nav system to use, he has to learn them in his head. And if you go and do the functional MRI, you go and do the brain scan that I showed you earlier on a London taxi cab driver whilst he is learning, and then you do it when he has learnt, you can show that there are physical changes in the brain. One bit of the brain that is associated with that sort of memory is physically larger. Blind people get much more auditory information from the world than you do. And one of the reasons for that is that the auditory part, the hearing part of their brain, takes over some of the redundant visual part of their brain and uses it for extra processing power. So when we're teaching people, when we're thinking about what we teach people, we are thinking about physical changes that we make to their brains. So finally, in summary, formal education is clearly essential. I couldn't have done what I do without the ability to read and write and learning physics and chemistry and maths. But they're not enough. I can't practice medicine without empathy. I can't practice medicine without being fit and healthy. I can't practice without understanding the lives of my patients. All learning results in physical changes. We need softer skills. In order to be able to use those skills that we acquire through formal education. The formal skills on their own are not enough. And that the best time to acquire and to retain these skills is when we are young. And I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Albert Einstein was regarded as a very average pupil at school. He didn't get on with a rather rigid learning process that went on in his school. And he developed his knowledge of mathematics and science in his spare time. So for him, something lit a light bulb in exactly the same way as my form mistress lit a light bulb around Mount Everest and this very strange, challenging environment. But Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. And I would give you one last little idea around that. I have always been fascinated, quite aside from the things I've been talking about, and if I had my career over again, I might actually end up in this as an area. I've always been fascinated by the whole business of genetic engineering and that interface between biology and engineering. And it occurs to me that one thing that might be very useful, perhaps in this post-apocalyptic world that you were talking about, is actually if we could grow structures that we can live in. There is an example for this. There is a part of India in a state called Meghalaya where the locals grow bridges over ravines. They use a property of the roots of a particular plant to grow out over a ravine, and then they make very stable, very durable, wonderful bridges. But perhaps we could use bamboo to grow structures. Perhaps we could genetically engineer it. Now that's an idea. That idea, once you have that, says, well, what do I need to be able to understand how we can make this work? That then becomes the driver for going off and for looking at how do we edit genes? How do we look at how genes are expressed in bamboo? All that formal knowledge which you have to have is actually secondary to the initial act of imagination. So there we are. In a sense, this is my plea for non-formal education and for remembering that in all the other things that happen to us, at the end of the day, we're human beings and we have to interact with each other, and that interaction is about soft skills. Thank you very much. Děkuji.